Hi everyone, welcome to the new episode of Peter's English Podcast. Welcome! Uh, in this episode, I want to talk about podcast. I like listening to my favorite English podcast because thanks to my English podcast, I've improved my listening skills in English. I like listening in English podcast because my favorite English podcasts are interesting, very funny, entertaining. The my English podcasts are full of entertainment and fun and education. And but we wanted to but I wanted to tell you what is podcast. Podcast is an audio or video program that has a lot of episodes. A podcast is published online. Every podcast is created for different topics. A podcast can be about educational, about education, learning languages, learning English, about history or culture. A podcast can create one person or a team of or a team of people. Podcast you can find on apps in iOS or Android. A lot of podcasts has their own website. There you can find it. My favorite English podcast has have their own websites. You can play podcasts on apps in on apps in cell phones. There are a lot of very good podcast app for listening to podcast. You have to only find your favorite podcast that is interesting for you. I recommend you to use English podcast for learning English. Listening to English podcast is the best way how to improve your listening skills in English, because you can hear, you can listen to real English from the street. Podcasts are very popular in the world. There are a lot of people they like listening to English to podcasts. You can there are a lot of different topics that use this podcast. You can find your favorite English your favorite podcast about every aspect, about every topic. You can use the best way how to use podcast is practicing your listening skills in English. The best option is, the best thing is that favorite English podcast, you can listen everywhere. You can do everything. You can uh, you can go to school, or you can go home from school, or you can go to work, or from to work. I I was thinking by bus, or you can listen to your favorite English podcast in the car, but please be careful. Please don't crash anyone, please. English. I recommend you to listen your favorite English podcast during the work in the home. I listen to my favorite English podcast when I every day, and I listening and I like listening to English podcasts because thanks to my favorite English podcast, I can do every work because I like listening to my favorite English podcast uh, uh, while I work at home. I've discovered that the best way how to doing something is listening to uh, my favorite English podcast, and I recommend you to listen to English podcasts too because they are free. There are a lot of there are a lot of hours of very good and interesting English podcasts. Thanks to them, you can improve your speaking skills in English, and and uh, and no and my favorite English podcasts are very funny, interesting, and and very good for you, of course. uh, Podcasters like to talk with their listeners, and 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 every good podcaster uh, uh, wants to read comments about this podcast, of course. And now we can talk about my favorite English podcast, and I want to recommend you um, three very good English podcasts for learning English. Uh, the first is Luke's English podcast. Luke's English podcast is a very good English podcast about learning uh, English. Luke Thompson is an English teacher from the UK, from London. He his podcast uses real British English. He is very funny. His podcast is very funny, very interesting. Luke Thompson is an English teacher and stand-up comedian. I recommend you to be a member of Webster community because Luke's English podcast is the best English podcast in the world. Thanks to Luke's English podcast, you can improve your speaking skills in English. You can listen to about the British culture, about the British accents, or you can listen to about other things. Luke is very funny and very interesting, and his podcast is the best English podcast in the world. And the second is Speak English podcast now with Georgiana. Georgiana is an English teacher from the United States of America. She teaches American English with humor and fun. She's very pretty, beautiful, and her podcast is very interesting and funny. She teaches about American English, about the life and culture in the United States of America. The third is all is English podcast. All is English podcast is American podcast. There are team of English American English female teachers. They are talking about learning English. You can find it on every good a podcast app. And yes, of course, you can find the best method how to learn English is how to learn your listening skills in English is listening to your favorite English podcast about a topic that is interesting for you. And because there are a lot of topics for that I wanted to tell you that English podcasts using a lot of different topics, and everyone can find everyone can find the topic that is interesting for these people, and you can find English podcasts about learning English, about history, about science, about technology, about sports. I found it a lot of interesting English podcasts about history and about learning English and about and about learning English, about technology and science, and about what else? I think you can find English podcasts about everything, of course. And what else? Yes, of course, English podcasts are free and they are very interesting. And yes, of course, you can listen to audiobooks in English. What is an audiobook? Audiobook is an audiobook of the real book. That audiobook is in that audiobook is audio. An audiobook is an is the audio version of the book. In that is an actor or actress that is the talking about the storyline. This audiobook is very interesting, and you can improve your English thanks to it if you want. And I think that that's all. I was in this episode. I was telling you about this podcast. Why is very interesting for you, and why, and how you can improve your English thanks to listening to very interesting English podcast. I was talking about my English podcast, about my favorite English podcast, and what else? I was forgetting what I wanted to say in the end, and I was talking about audiobooks in English. Yes, of course. I want to repeat you. My favorite English podcast is Luke's English podcast. This is the English podcast created by very good English teacher Luke Thompson from London, from the UK. He teaches real British English with humor and fun. His podcast is very funny and interesting. Because Lux Thompson is an English teacher and stand-up comedian. The second is Speak English podcast now by Georgiana. Georgiana is very beautiful and interesting English teacher. She teaches American English, and her podcast is about American culture and life in the United States of America. And the third is All Is English. All Is English is an American English podcast about learning English. In fact, team of English teachers are talking about learning English. And I think, what else now? I'm sorry, people, for my but okay. I'm trying to improving my speaking skills in English, and I wanted to practice my speaking skills in English, and I think this episode is full. You now what is podcast that you can, that is very good, and I want to end this episode right now, and I want to tell you bye bye.